To a new series today, and I think the best way to launch into this is to ask you a question of, can you remember the last time you were trapped? Because no one likes feeling trapped. I think for me, it was back in March of this year. We were in Baltimore trying to get home from my niece's wedding. And during the reception, we started getting alerts on our phone that our flight was going to be delayed. And we had a 9 p.m. flight, and we were trying to get back, and the airline started sending us these alerts. And look, I'm not going to throw some airline under the bus and say how bad they are. I'm not even going to tell you what airline it was, but it was Southwest. And we were supposed to have a 9 a.m. flight back to Austin, but after 8 or 10 delay alerts during the reception, we now had a departure time of 3:30 a.m. It was especially tough for me because that weekend was also time change, meaning that we were going to lose an hour anyway. And then it was a Saturday night, and I was supposed to preach the next Sunday morning, and so I quickly grabbed a seat on another flight the next morning at 6 a.m., but I wasn't even sure I was even going to be able to make it home on that flight. It was just going to be iffy whether or not I even made it, but I felt like I needed some sort of backup. And so I reached out to a couple of our staff members and just said, hey, here's what's going on. If I don't make it, best of luck. Here's my notes. I called the airlines, and I like, what can I do? Is there anything we can do? Can we arrange everything? And it was all about our flight had not left where it was originally from, and this is all these things. And I got to tell you, after a little while, as we started approaching like 11 o'clock, I'm feeling trapped, like there's nothing I can do. In fact, I after calling the airlines, I felt even more trapped that I'm stuck here, and I just thought, I'm just never going to fly again. That's all this is. I'm going to take a bus wherever I go because I don't like the way this feels. And maybe you've felt that way in different times as well. Maybe you've been in an elevator. Certainly, you've probably been on a flight before. Maybe it's in a bus or on a car. Maybe you've been in a room. But the fact is, none of us like to feel trapped. And so what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks is potentially a problem for all of us, that perhaps we can be trapped in our own minds. And I'm sure you know this, but all of us carry around a mindset. In fact, you woke up with a mindset today. We call it a frame of mind. You woke up with a certain frame of mind today. You walked in with a frame of mind. You decided to get online or walk in Leander or Liberty Hill. You decided to do this with a certain frame of mind, a certain mindset. In fact, a mindset is this. A mindset is a way of thinking. That's all it is. It's a mentality. And you know this to be true, that once you get your mind right, everything else seems to follow. The problem is we have these thoughts, and our thoughts, fortunately or unfortunately, can create feelings. And it's not necessarily what happens to you, but it's the messages that you give yourself about what happens that determines your feelings. Like, what messages are you telling yourself that determine your feelings? And not only do our thoughts create all of our feelings, but our thoughts that defeat us are almost always wrong or distorted, and in many cases illogical. And sometimes those thoughts form a cycle called a mentality or a mind trap. And so how do you know? How do you know when a mindset has become a mind trap? There's an ancient Greek philosopher named Epictetus who said this: we are disturbed not by things, but by the view in which we take of them. We think it's the circumstances that are disturbing us, but it's our view of the circumstances that are really disturbing us. And that's what this entire series is about. And so I wanted to get started today with a quote that I wanted you to see from Helen Keller. And if you don't know who Helen Keller was, she was born blind and deaf and went on to do so much good for our society. And she introduces the topic that we're going to talk about today. Here's what she says. She says that self-pity is our worst enemy. And look, if anyone could have had self-pity, it would have been her. And she said, and if we yield to that self-pity, we can never do good, look at this, anything wise in this world. And so over the next few weeks, we want to talk about some specific mind traps that all of us have the potential to get caught up in. And so today we're going to talk about the why does this keep happening trap. And then next week we're going to talk about the negative thoughts trap, or the Sunday after Mother's Day. And then the final week of this, we're actually going to talk about what's called the pass-fail trap. And we'll describe that a little bit more. And my hope is for every single one of us that we would be able to get out of this feeling that we all have. And maybe you have it right now. I mean, even as you hear what this is about and that the church is talking about mental health, this series and what it's going to be about, you thought, oh, I know someone who's super negative. They definitely need to hear that. There's something wrong with that, but I would love for us to get past that and go to what is it that's in me? What actually is in my mind that could use an upgrade? Because the truth about all of us, no matter who you are, what your background is, we're all on the same level playing field. Because all of us have been, will be, and possibly even are currently being trapped by our own thoughts. And that becomes our mental health. And so today, let's talk about what it means to be trapped in a way of thinking where you feel like a victim or you see the world through the lens of I'm a victim. And why does this keep happening to me? And so I want to give you a couple of different scenarios, and let me just tell you, these scenarios are not about any one of you. In fact, they're not about anyone specifically. I tried AI out on these scenarios, but I didn't like them, so I created my own. And so again, they're not about you. If this is a little too personal and you're like, is he really talking about me? I'm not, I promise you. These are generic examples that try to help us all get on the same page. And so let me give you a couple of examples. You might have the victim mentality, caught up in the, why does this keep happening to me? If you're a parent, I mean, we just saw some of those on our stage. A parent who maybe your kid has just got in trouble at school, you maybe just got in a fight at school. Maybe your natural way of thinking is, well, there's no way that's my kid's fault, because they never would have done that. It had to be the other kid's fault, or because that kid, I know that kid, they're so annoying. Or it was the teacher's fault because, come on, they allowed this to happen. Get some control of your classroom. Because my kid would never do that. He's a victim. Or maybe this is a scenario at work where there was a promotion that you really wanted and you didn't get it. And instead of evaluating what did I do or didn't do that didn't put me in a better position, you just go right to, well, my dumb boss. It's her fault. She's always had it out for me. She's always had a problem with me. From the first day I started working there, I just could tell she didn't like me. I can tell by the way she looks at me. And it has nothing to do with the fact that I've just spent a lot of time on TikTok and shopping on Amazon while I'm there. It's the boss's fault. I'm the victim here. Or maybe if you got in a car accident because someone just started to drift over into your lane and caused you to hit something, immediately go, well, it was his fault. It has nothing to do with the fact that maybe you were distracted or not paying as much attention as you should have or maybe wanted to. No, you're the victim. And honestly, this happens at church too. If you're in a small group of Jesus followers who get together weekly, this can happen. Small group leader asking a question, and you're like, of course they're going to ask somebody else to answer that. It's like, I'm pretty sure this leader doesn't even like me in the first place. They don't ever call on me. There were 8 of us in the room, and they just don't ever talk to me. And here goes again, not asking my opinion. And lo and behold, check this out. The church is just filled with cliques. I mean, the last church I was in, there were cliques in that. And look here, there's cliques in this one as well. Here we go again. Why does this keep happening to me? And look, I could go on and on and on with examples and illustrations, but the question is, where in your life, where in my life am I trapped in feeling like a victim? Could I just give you the clinical definition for this real quick? A victim mentality causes us to blame others for our problems. A victim might say things like, I'm always at a disadvantage because of my circumstances. Or everyone else is out to get me, or everyone else, they just had it easier than me. It's always been harder for me. And so let me just say, every single one of us has experienced this victim mentality. Every one of us has different areas in our lives we are caught up in this victim mentality mind trap. And the conversations end up being about my drama and my stories, and it ends up becoming like this self-fulfilling prophecy, like I'm miserable, therefore I am. Now, let's be honest, because I want to recognize that there are actually victims in the world. I mean, there's victims here today. And I don't want to diminish that. I certainly don't want to rush past what happened to you. It might have been a crime. It might have been racism. It might have been sexism. It might have been abuse. It might have been some sort of injustice. There are always truth to people's stories because bad things happen to all of us. Life is not always a pretty picture. And so I want to invite you, though, even though, yes, you might be and you probably are a victim, would you consider evaluating? Is this mentality good for me? Is it good for the people around me? Is there a way that I could be thinking differently? At the very least, would I consider, instead of thinking of myself as a victim, what would it look like if I began to think of myself as a survivor? Maybe that would open like a brand new way, a new thought, and allow me to move past some of the consequences of this victim mentality that is a trap. And where does the mentality trap come from? If we're being honest, part of it comes from our temperament, right? Like, I don't know which one of your personality tests of choice you like, because there's just so many of them these days. But, maybe you're a high S, or maybe you're an ESTJ, or maybe you're a QR with an X wing, or maybe you're a 7 with a 6 on the side. I don't know. So certainly there are temperaments or wirings or personalities that are more prone to being caught up in this mentality trap. But quite honestly, this trap probably comes mostly from the home we were born into or the family we were born into. What I'm talking about is our family of origin. Probably that's what causes us to think or feel this way more than anything else. There are certain homes, and maybe this is the kind of family that you grew up in, where it was just accepted that it was always somebody else's fault. It's always the coach's fault. It's always the principal's fault. It's the boss's fault. It's the preacher's fault. And maybe the script that you grew up with was that if I'm miserable, you have to love me. And maybe you were allowed to feel that way over and over, and you used it to gain like a sense of control. And maybe you've never actually challenged yourself to see that there's a better way. And so what I want to do today is I want to introduce you to a person from the Old Testament in the scripture, a person in the nation of Israel who had every right to feel like and to claim and to actually be a victim because things did not go well over and over and over. But instead, he was able to get past it and get above it, and he was able to change his mind about what was happening in his life, and when he did, it freed him up to live the kind of life that he wouldn't have otherwise been able to live. And so his name is Joseph. Joseph is the son of Jacob and Rachel, and best that we can tell, he had 10 half-brothers, 1 full brother, and a half-sister. Joseph, from a very early age, was preferred by his father. His father showed that favor to him by, he gave him this special article of clothing. It was this cool coat made of all these different colors. Maybe it was stripes. Maybe it was tie-dye. We don't really know, but he got it when he was a kid, and his dad gave it to him because he and his dad were just so connected. I don't know what that maybe it might have been for you. For me, it was a Dallas Cowboys bomber jacket, right? But for Joseph, it was a coat of many colors, which was his father's way of saying, I like you better than all your brothers. And Joseph, from a young age, just grabbed a hold of this sense of confidence, and that's what led him, and that's what he led with. And how do we know this? Well, because he told his brothers about it all the time. He would have these dreams, and he would say, hey, I want you guys all to know, as my brothers, that one day the day is going to come when you're going to be bowing down in front of me. And I don't know about you, but that just never seems to go well with your siblings, does it? And so they ended up finding a pit. They got so tired of it, they found this pit, and they throw him in it, and they're just going to leave him for dead. Because, I guess a brother's got to do what a brother's got to do, right? And by the way, don't act like you never thought about throwing one of your siblings in a pit, right? You just didn't have a pit, right? And then his brothers decided, hey, you know what? We're not just going to leave him there to die because we don't get anything out of that. We should get something for what we're doing here. And so fortunately for them, there was a caravan coming by that sold spices and grains, and this caravan was going all the way to Egypt. And so they sell their brother into slavery. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, his family. And so there Joseph was living in Egypt, away from his family, away from his home. Think about the messages that he could have told himself about what had just happened. But somehow, he didn't allow that to stop him. He took the circumstances that could absolutely have derailed him, and he decided to bounce back from it. And because of that decision, he started to rise to the top in Egypt. There was a ruler in Egypt named Potiphar who was a very wealthy person, and he noticed Joseph's capabilities and his leadership traits and how he had a positive attitude about everything. And so he put Joseph in charge of more and more and more, to the point where now Joseph was running all of Potiphar's entire estate. And then one day, Joseph realized for the first time ever that he possessed something that I have never experienced: dashing good looks. And Potiphar's wife decided, I think I'm kind of into him, and I'd like to see what could happen. And so one day while he was there in the house, Potiphar's wife corners him and tells him how she feels and what she wants to do. And Joseph could have done anything he wanted in that moment, but he decided to run. And when he ran away, she grabs his outer garment, and instead of turning and fighting to try to get it back, he just leaves it and runs. But unfortunately, Potiphar's wife told her own victim's story. And you're not going to believe what this slave of yours did to me. And Potiphar is furious and immediately throws Joseph into prison. So not only was Joseph sold into slavery, Joseph was falsely accused of something he didn't do. And while he's in prison, there's this whole dramatic scene where he ends up meeting a couple of guys that could have really helped him out. One of them was a baker, but not just any baker. He was the king's baker. One of them was a cupbearer, but not just any cupbearer. He was the king's cupbearer. Because of what had happened in their own lives, they found themselves in prison with Joseph. But again, Joseph was a hustler. He had a great attitude. He started to rise in the ranks of the prison, and he was in a leadership position in the prison, and the baker and the cupbearer were under his command at this point. And they start having these conversations about some of the dreams they were having, and they were telling Joseph about them. And Joseph said, hey, that's no problem. I can tell you what your dreams mean, because Joseph had this talent, like this God-given ability to interpret dreams. And so he interpreted their dreams to them correctly about when they would get out of prison and when they would make it back into Pharaoh's service. And the line in the scripture is just so disturbing, because he told them when they would get out and back to their positions. But the line says, when they got back to their positions, so disturbing, they forgot Joseph, even while he was in prison. And so he's sold into slavery, he's falsely accused, and then he's forgotten in prison. Can you imagine the feelings of betrayal and emotions? Like, how could this have happened? Why in the world is this going on? And in Joseph's case, why is this happening again? But somehow, Joseph didn't let those negative circumstances keep him from realizing that God had more for him. That even in the middle of all of this, that God was doing something great. It's amazing how the prison sometimes causes us to question everything. And I'm talking about these mental prisons, these traps that we find ourselves in, where we start asking all of the tough questions like, God, why? What are you doing? God, how could you let this happen again? How could you let this happen to me? And somehow Joseph seemed to ask this question: could God be setting up the circumstances to do something in me and through me? Because that's a different question. Is God aligning the stars? Is he doing something so great that no one would even be able to deny that it was God and that he's the one doing all of this? I mean, I don't know how Joseph could have asked this question, but clearly something is guiding Joseph to the point where this dramatic scene unfolds in Genesis chapter 50, towards the end of Joseph's life. Joseph had gotten out of prison, and Pharaoh had heard about his skill and about his gift, and it had elevated him to a higher position. He had been responsible, he had been faithful, he had been diligent, and now he is number 2 in command of all of Egypt when Pharaoh has his own dream about a famine that's going to hit this area. And not just in Egypt, but all the land around, including Canaan, where Joseph came from and where his family is. And so Joseph leads the country to do a lot of amazing things and to save up a lot of food so that when the famine hits, the whole country's ready. But his family back in Canaan didn't do this. And the times were so tough that his father Jacob said to his son, the only thing there is left to do is for you guys to go to Egypt and beg for some help. And so his brothers, the same brothers, pack up and make their way to Egypt, where they have this face-to-face altercation with none other than their younger brother. And for a moment, Joseph is able to have a conversation with them where they didn't know his identity. But when the moment comes for his identity to be revealed, and the brothers realize that now we are standing face to face with the very person that we threw into the pit. And they are scared, fearing for their lives, as you could imagine. And Joseph responds to them. And what Joseph says to them gives us a look into Joseph's mind and what it was that allowed him to live in such a different way other than being a victim. So from Genesis 50, verse 19, but Joseph said to them, how do you say this? Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Meaning, I'm not a judge over what you did. God is. I don't have the ability to look through circumstances and figure out what God's doing. That's not my job. That's God's job. And maybe that's exactly what Joseph was able to do when he was sold into slavery. And maybe everything in him wanted to be the avenger, the one to go out and get revenge for what they did to him. But he had to decide in a moment, am I in the place of God to do that? And he came to the answer, no. When he was falsely accused, he had to decide, am I going to take up my own cause or submit to the one who can actually do something about it? Am I in the place of God? No. When he was forgotten about in prison, and it would have been so easy to just believe the lies that if everyone has forgotten about me, maybe God has forgotten about me as well. But he knew the character of God, that God is not one to forget. And he reminds himself yet again, am I in the place of God? No. God was with me when I was sold into slavery. God was with me whenever I was falsely accused. God was with me when I was in the prison. And God is with us and with you right now, no matter what's going on. And if you were convinced that God was with you, then what kind of thoughts would be going through your mind? I mean, are we really victims like we tell ourselves we are? Look at the way Joseph reframes his thinking. Here's what he says. He says to his brothers, don't be afraid. You intended to harm me. I get it. Let's be honest about it. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended to harm me, and that's bad. But here's the good news. You don't control the world, brothers. God does. And he's using this to set up something that none of us could have seen happening. He's aligning the circumstances. He's aligning the stars in Joseph's life, and not just for Joseph's good, but for the good of all those around Joseph. Why would we not believe that too? Maybe God is aligning the circumstances of your life for something great that you can't yet see. Yes, let's be honest, you might be a victim. Joseph certainly was. Yes, what was done to you might have been wrong. But what if you chose to believe that they meant it for harm, but God is going to do something good through it? How would things change for you? How would it be different? What would it look like? How would we think if we just looked at our situation differently? Instead of being bitter and frustrated and angry, what if we just read those circumstances differently? And maybe it does no good to tell ourselves, I'm the victim. Because God could actually be setting up the circumstances around you to do something in you and through you. All this wrong that has been done to me, maybe we could get to a place where we could say, God, could you be using this to do something in me and through me? Look at what Joseph says to him. He says, so then, don't be afraid, because I'm going to provide for you. I'm in that position now, and I'm going to take care of your kids. He spoke kindly to them. How beautiful is that? And look, this is huge, because one of the problems with feeling like a victim is we feel out of control. Control is a really tricky thing. It's not helpful for us to feel like we're in control of everything. You know people like that, right? Don't look at them, but you know people like that. You know that just causes devastation on everyone around you, but at the same time you sit back believing there's nothing you can do about that. Look, control is tricky and it's complex, but there are things you can control. Like Joseph controlling his response to his brothers. Am I going to respond in retaliation, or am I going to respond in kindness? And he decided to do good for them and good for their kids. And he reassured them and he spoke kindly to them. So look, instead of determining what we can't control, to get out of this victim mind trap, we've got to decide, what is it I can control and take control of? Take control of that. So before we go today, I want to help you, because I don't want to just tell you. I want to help you, because if it's not helpful, we've wasted our time. And so I want to give you just a very simple plan to find, if you find yourself in this victim mentality trap. I want to give you a couple of thoughts from the story of Joseph that might help you this week, maybe today, with what's going on with you. The first one is this: you got to identify your own victim thoughts. Why? Because if you don't ever identify them, you're never actually going to fight against them. And once you start doing this, you're going to see them everywhere. It's kind of like when you want a new car, right? And all of a sudden, every person is driving one, and you're like, did everybody in our city just get one of these cars? No, you just are noticing. You're aware now, right? And the same is true about your own thoughts. When you start identifying them, you get better, and you start seeing more of them, and that allows you to start dealing with them. Here's another step that you could take: is be aware of the false benefits of victim thoughts. You know what a negative falses are, right? If you're a sugar person, like after lunch, you're going to go find a piece of chocolate or something sweet, right? And if so, you get this. And if not, if you don't get this, then I don't believe anything you ever say about anything, right? You know what that feels like, where you just started training yourself that after dinner or after lunch, I'm going to go get that little bit of fix. Because it does do some immediate good, right? Like what does it do? It gives you a little energy rush. It kind of makes you feel good. It releases things in your brain, this excess of dopamine or serotonin, and it makes you feel good about your life right then, right? And you're like, man, I am so glad I found this piece of cake. But then like an hour later, you're laying on the bathroom floor, you're trying to take a nap at work because there's a sugar crash after the fix. That benefit that you got from that was actually a false benefit. And when it comes to our victim mentalities, the same thing is true. It allows us to actually avoid having to take responsibility from anything, about anything, because it's always someone else's fault. People give us their attention when we have this mentality. When we start with our sob story, people pay attention. They feel sorry for us, and we're more likely to actually get what we want because we can use those emotions to manipulate other people. So we have to be aware, like, hey, a part of me actually likes this victim mentality. And as we do that, it starts to take the power away from that mind trap. And then the third one is this, is identify them, be aware of the false benefits, and then you got to replace these thoughts with something more helpful. So what's more helpful? Well, you could start by just reminding yourself of a perspective that, as bad as it may be, that God uses bad. That's a different perspective. God uses bad. God uses the difficult. He makes us stronger in this. And if it weren't for the hard situations in life, we just wouldn't grow like God wants us to grow. It's often the resistance that we actually find growth. In that resistance, we find growth and we make gains. So there may be a silver lining. Maybe it's what you can control. If we took a page from Joseph's book, look at what he did. He did something for someone else. Maybe you could decide, hey, whenever I catch that victim trap mentality, those victim thoughts coming on, that's going to be my cue to go find something I can do for someone else. Because when you do for someone else, it gets you out of thinking about only you. So I want to ask you, would you choose to replace it with something more helpful? And would you choose to believe that God is aligning the circumstances around you to do something in you and through you? Freedom is always so much better than being trapped. And so my hope and my prayer as we go through this series is that every one of us would get to a place where we could go, yeah, there is a lot going on around me. I've got a lot of circumstances and they're not all pretty in my life. But instead of feeling like a victim, I'm going to choose to believe, God, that you are aligning the stars. You are aligning these circumstances to do something great in me and to do something great through me. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for who you are, and thank you for your thoughts about our thoughts. And so, Father, as we walk through this series, would you help us? Would you help us to open our minds to your way? Help us to learn from others around us, and help us to know that you are always up to something good in our lives, even when everything we can see is bad. Would you help us to begin to make that shift in our thoughts? And we ask it in